nanohub.org.
Online simulation and more for nanotechnology.
Yeah, good morning, and thanks to Professor Tsai and Sam and all the other organizers for inviting me to the workshop. It's very exciting for me. And so I'd like to share with you some of our work in autonomous research systems for my particular area, which is carbon nanotube synthesis, but I'll actually make it much broader than that, really much more on the autonomous research systems. So I would ask us to think broadly about how we would like to do research in the future. And for that, we need to think a little bit about how we're doing research currently. And so there's a number of different references in this area, but really the bottom line is that we're putting more and more money into research and technology, but we're not going as fast as we hope. We really are only getting a linear advance when we think we're getting this exponential advance. Certainly in materials, this is true. And then I recently came across this quote by Professor Kitano from Japan, who says that scientific discovery is at a pre-industrial revolution level. So that for me is very telling. I've been putting it sort of like, our research processes are related to The Alchemist, the picture you see on the left there, where we're very much in manual processes, very human-driven processes. So how do we change that? The other way to think about it is that our current working environment, we just have not enough money to do the work that we need to do. We don't have enough people, and the research is simply too slow. And we just are not moving fast enough is our problem. So this is another slide from Professor Kitano, and he's brought about, and I think this is very motivating for me, and I've been sharing it quite a bit. So Professor Kitano, if you know him from the robotics world, has this RoboCup challenge where robots can play at the World Cup soccer level. And so his recent one from 2016 is, can we build an AI scientist that can win a Nobel Prize by 2050? Now he's actually looking at it in the biological sciences, but I think actually they're trying to make it broader now. And the other part is, can it actually pass the Turing test? So that's why it's the Nobel Turing test, where the robot writes a paper and passes the Turing test, which is also kind of fun. But the other part that you can see from the graph is this: if you go from left to right, you see it going from the current status, which is low autonomy and low, let's say, artificial intelligence, to using AI to improve our intelligence and to do better jobs at understanding what we have. But the big leap then comes in the combination of intelligence and autonomy. That is, AI by itself won't do the job. We must have the two together. And I'll talk about that as we go along. And just from a U.S. Department of Defense, the interesting thing here is that the DoD sees it. So we see AI as a tool to free up resources, time, and manpower so our people can focus on higher priority tasks and arrive at a decision point, whether in the lab or a battlefield, faster and more precise than the competition. So I think this idea of freeing up people's time so that they can work on the more important things is really the critical takeaway here. Okay, so as I said, I work on carbon nanotubes, and I understand that Boris gave a great talk last night, and he and I have this idea for carbon nanotubes where you go through this hype cycle, the Gartner hype cycle, and I think nanotubes went through it earlier. You go through this peak of inflated expectation, you come crashing down. But nanotubes, I'll make the argument, are actually on the slope of enlightenment. We're actually going back up. There's serious industry involvement. ARPA-E in the US has been doing a lot of work in methane pyrolysis. And so it's actually coming back. And I would say maybe that graphene and 2D are further back on this curve, but I think it is the normal cycle for us. So can carbon nanotubes save the planet? And this is the ARPA-E program that I mentioned. Rice University is heavily involved with Shell. But the basic concept is if we take our significant methane resources and pyrolyze them, the output is hydrogen, which we can use for the hydrogen economy, which is clean. And we take the carbon and make carbon nanotubes. And now the carbon is sequestered, so it's not contributing to global warming. But the catch is that we have to do this at a scale of hundreds of millions of tons per year. So much beyond the gram or even kilogram quantities that we're making today. It actually has to change the materials market at a global level. So that's quite a challenge. And of course, the issue is that we can't make nanotubes at scale cost effectively. Part of the reason why we can't is because the space for making carbon nanotubes, the parameter space, if you will, is just overwhelmingly large. There are too many parameters, too many knobs to turn, if you will, to try and get to that magic set of conditions to grow nanotubes effectively. And so that means that we can't make them at scale, we can't control diameter, chirality, all of the things we need. And so what I would say is if you're the lone researcher, sort of that alchemist, or a researcher at a pre-industrial stage, sure, it is overwhelmingly large. But if you have now a robot, an autonomous research robot to help you in that, then it becomes a tractable problem. So what we did is we built our autonomous research system, which we call ARES. And our ARES system essentially makes carbon nanotubes by seeding catalyst onto the pillars that you see on the left and heating the catalyst with a laser in the presence of a growth gas. And we grow carbon nanotubes. And we can tell because we use that same heating laser to essentially do Raman spectroscopy. And so you can see in the middle plot, the waterfall plot, you can see the growth of the carbon nanotubes over time by the increase of the G-band. And from that, we extract a growth rate, so the slope of the G-band versus time. And so that's our output result. And this is a really critical ingredient for closed loop research, is you need to have a signal, an in situ or inline output that tells you how things are going. So our trick was that not only could we do experiments 100 times faster, because now each of those experiments takes 5 minutes, and in a normal tube furnace, it might take a day. So we're doing 100 experiments a day instead of 1 experiment a day. The trick for doing the autonomous research, and this goes back to the loop figure that Sam was showing, is that after every experiment, we then feed those results plus the previous results to an artificial intelligence planner, which analyzes the results and then chooses a new set of experiments that goes towards our goal. And that is what enables us to fully close the loop to do iterative autonomous research. And so that's the key there, is to being able to close the loop. And of course, the ability in the upper right hand, is that we have to, those ingredients that you see, we have to have in situ diagnostics. We'd like to have modeling and regression to evaluate and understand what we had, and then use artificial intelligence, data science, and decision theory to make better decisions about what experiments to do next. And so in our paper a number of years ago now, the result is that on the top panel, you can see as we go from left to right, we have started 0 experiments, and we go over hundreds of iterations, not just experiments, but experimental iterations where we learn from the previous experiment. And what you're seeing there is the maximum growth rate as analyzed by Raman spectroscopy, and the solid line is what we wanted the growth rate to be, and the different colored dots are what actually happened experimentally. And as you can see, as you go from left to right, at first there's a lot of scatter, and we're not very close to the experimental objective. But as we get to around between 500 and 600, the system essentially converges. That is, it learns how to grow carbon nanotubes at controlled rates, and we could subsequently move the rate up or down, and it would reach that rate within essentially the noise floor of our system, which is what the bottom panel is meant to say, is that we start with a lot of scatter. So the green vertical bars that you see are big, and then they get smaller to the point where they're within the noise floor of our system. So that was our big result. And I would say some people are confused about the distinction between autonomous research and other kinds of high throughput methods. So for example, the MGI, Materials Genome Initiative, is a well-known effort and foundational for increasing the speed of research by doing modeling and simulation in the place of experimentation. And on the right, you see high throughput and combinatorial methods, which is essentially library approaches where you do lots and lots of experiments. But the distinction for both of these is that you're not doing lots of iterations. That is, you're doing lots of experiments, but it's hard to learn iteratively. And if you think about a search, you get one shot with lots of experiments, but then you have to learn only from what those are. And a lot of times, a lot of those experiments are uninformative. Early on, Ross King built the Robot Scientist. So this is from 2009, and that was for functional genomics. And he was the first one I know of to do a fully autonomous research robot. And so just again, to capture the ideas of AI and ML, if we think about a loop where you're generating experimental information, could be not just through hardware experimentation, but you could generate information through simulation or through data mining. It could be through mining literature. You can use artificial intelligence to analyze those data. So you can do segmentation or extraction of meaning. You can figure out what properties are best. You can link the outputs to the inputs to the outputs. But that's only that's I would say what many people are doing in AI applied to materials. What distinguishes autonomous research is that bottom part of the loop there, the decision part. And that is knowing what you know, what would you do next to best achieve your goals? And the goal could be targeting growth rate. It could be maximizing a certain property. There are lots of different goals that you could have. And the decision methodology or decision policy that you use will often depend on what your goal is. But we can use all of these different algorithms that you see on the right. And we have then new algorithms or old algorithms. It really depends on what you'd like to use. But again, our data environment is challenging, right? It's incomplete, it's uncertain, it's confusing. And I would say compared to a lot of, say, big data kinds of things, our data is not typically as big as, say, for example, Facebook or someone like that. So this is just again to summarize some of the different decision-making approaches. What's nice about the Aries approaches that and closed loop in general is that you can use conventional techniques, but you can also use advanced techniques, which tend to be interesting as well. So just to go through some of our more recent results that I'll go through quickly here. So with Mark Pitt and Jae Myung at Ohio State University, we ran a campaign using a Bayesian optimization decision algorithm. And what you see there are two different runs with a number of seed experiments and about 75, 100 closed loop iterations. And what you can see is that, and that's the square root of the growth rate. So the objective was to maximize the growth rate. And you can see that with a lot of scatter, essentially we ended up with a 4x increase in the growth rate of the carbon nanotubes while allowing the BO planner to optimize across 4 different variables. So that was exciting for us. And with Chris Reyes, who's a professor at the University of Buffalo, he thinks a lot more about the decision-making modalities. And I won't do justice to his approach there, but what he really does is looking at, separates them out into belief models. So you think about what the uncertainty, not just what the response function is, but what its uncertainty is. And then as you go around the loop in the upper right, you see you use that current belief model to make a decision about the most strategically advantageous experiment to do. And that could be not just to reduce uncertainty, but to do a combination of reducing uncertainty and potentially achieving your experimental campaign objective. So then you do the experiment and you update. And so what using Chris's policy, which is called the gradient, knowledge gradient descent, Holmes, is to essentially improve the selectivity for single chirality carbon nanotubes. So what you see in the plots there are radial breathing mode Raman spectra, and I won't go into the details, but as you can see on the left, there are just a lot of different kinds of carbon nanotube diameters. And we were targeting on the right panel a specific diameter of carbon nanotube. And you can see that going from left to right, it's much improved. In fact, it's 5x increase over the non-optimized or random mode. And also, if you think about it in terms of small diameter nanotubes versus large diameter nanotubes, we got an 8-fold increase in selectivity just over a brief campaign. So that's been exciting for us as well. Now we're working on thinking about explicit hypothesis testing. And so I would say in a lot of techniques, so for example, if we go back to the Bayesian optimization, the Bayesian technique was naive. It had no understanding of physics and chemistry. It was just a statistical approach to it. But if we start to input information about reduction, then we can start to explicitly use those as our campaign objectives. And now we're doing science, right? Now we're trying to test actual hypotheses. And so with Professor Chiwo Park at Florida State, we've been then doing some very nice work using his jump regression technique. And I would say a lot of people are going after Gaussian processes, and that works a lot of the time. But in materials, we sometimes have discontinuities like phase transformations. And for those, a Gaussian process is not appropriate because Gaussian processes count on continuous behavior. And so these are just early results, but we've been able to essentially target and refine the boundaries of where these discontinuities happen over multidimensional parameter space in just a very few number of experiments. And we've then been able to use that combined with a transfer learning technique to transfer it from one catalyst thickness to another. So very exciting for us. And then just to finish on the carbon nanotube parts, with Chad Merkin's group, we've been looking at library approaches where Chad's group can do mega libraries of nanomaterials, mega and nano in the same title. But with his techniques, which is very, very impressive, he's able to make control both size and composition in single, pure element, binary, ternary, quaternary, and quinary alloy compounds. So imagine the power of sorting through those libraries, but also doing it selectively in closed loop using the Aries. So we're working towards that. We just demonstrated an open loop process there. Okay, so now I'm done with the nanotubes, and I'll talk broadly about where we're going. So essentially, what we did to build our Aries system was we had to really focus on software. And out of that, we developed our own Aries OS. It's an autonomous research operating system, which is will be released as open source in a month or two. Essentially, the intent of the Aries OS is to provide a platform or a framework by which anyone who wants to can make or build their own research robot. That is, you have the sort of foundational OS. I think of it as like a phone OS where maybe some graduate student or postdoc can build an app around it. But it starts you off with a lot of the infrastructure and really shortens that development time for groups to build their own autonomous research robots. And so we're very excited about that. And one of the first things that we did is to build a fully autonomous 3D printer. So the printer can take a target. In this case, it was just to print a line start. And you can see that over a number of iterations, the target is the outline. I'm looking at the middle sort of Q-tip panel that it printed. So that beginning of the line starts out not looking very good. And after a number of iterations, it gets very close to the intended target. And so it's fully autonomous. It's able to teach itself how to print. We made it for about $2,500 in parts. And we're now working towards reducing that cost down in order of magnitude to about $250 in parts, at which point it becomes accessible to even high schools and people just wanting to do research on their own. But anyhow, so the robot, the hardware, and the software and the data will all be available as open source. So very exciting for us. And really, this is to promote access so that more people can build their own autonomous research robots. So a year and a half ago almost, we ran a workshop on autonomous systems for materials development, led by my colleagues, Eric Stack at Penn, along with Brian DeCoste, Aaron Gilai Kuzne, and Jason Hadrick-Simpers at NIST. And we talked about the needed investments, so better automation, robot-friendly experimental tools, and the ability to autonomously or automatically change samples from one tool to another. Software, absolutely critical. So APIs for hardware are something that's a sticking point for a lot of automation. And then not just our software, but there are others, ChemOS, Computer, all of those platforms for autonomous research, and then better algorithms. And so, again, just to think about how to conceptualize autonomous research, going back to Professor Kitano's quote about being at the pre-industrial stage for research, if you think of the early days in computing, right? If you talked about computers in the 40s, you were usually talking about people with adding machines, so and usually women. And then when we got computers, that is hardware computers. So we have Melba Roy, who was subject of the movie Hidden Figures, who went on to do computer science for NASA, and she's there with a mainframe, right? But now, of course, we have computers that we call cell phones that have much more computing power than the mainframe, and we don't even think about it. We just say, yes, we've got tons of computing power in our pockets that help us do amazing things, and we don't even see them as computers anymore. But the point is that computers can replace cognitive labor of humans. So we think about farmers and tractors. So the tractors replace the manual work of a human, and the computers replace the cognitive labor of a human. And so thinking about a broad future, a broad 20-year future for the progression of autonomous research, we think that as we start here 2020, 2021, we'll start to connect our instruments and integrate them, and then we'll increase in connectivity until it's all integrated in a globally integrated research network, at which point we expect network effects, tipping points, these kinds of phenomena. But that in general, the speed of research will go up exponentially, so the output of research per researcher. But because, as I made the point with the additive manufacturing and the 3D printing robot, because we can make them more accessible, we will essentially increase the number of researchers because research will become more accessible. So why do I think that's important? It's very concerning to me when I saw this quote here that children lose confidence in their potential to be scientists, but not in their capacity to do science. And that, for me, is something we really need to combat. And it's not a research problem. It's really one of access and how we support our educational environment. And this is especially true amongst underrepresented groups, so girls, minorities, and lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So we really need to combat this. And what I've been trying to popularize is this idea of a Moore's law for research. So on the previous chart, I showed you an exponential increase in the speed of research. But the corollary of that is that as we're able to do research faster, so thinking of research experiments or iterations exponentially faster, just as computing speed got faster, the cost went exponentially down, the cost per transistor, the cost per cycle. And so I also expect that for Moore's law of research, that the cost to do research will go down exponentially as well. And because that cost goes down, now we have greater access and we have the ability for ordinary citizens to do science themselves. And so that hopefully will give rise to an increase in citizen science. And so with my co-conspirator, Marty Burke, professor at UIUC, we're trying to get this idea off the ground of a 1 billion scientist movement, where research is so accessible that we can see a future of 1 billion scientists. And what if we could do that? What problems could we do? What problems couldn't we do if we were able to have a society of 1 billion scientists? So that for me is very inspirational. If you're worried about robots taking your job, I would say probably not. We want robots because robots take over the tedious, dangerous, repetitive tasks. They should be seen more as teammates who help do things that they can do better. And now we have a new division of labor where human researchers design and oversee experimental campaigns. They verify, they authorize, and they take on the tasks that require creativity and insight, things that robots can't do. And the computers are, for example, good at reasoning in high-dimensional parameter space. So rather than research robots taking researchers' jobs, we should see this as teaming of humans and robot researchers to partner and do things better than either could on their own. So we're trying to build a workforce development partnership to meet these needs because our current workforce does not have these sets of skills to be in teams of with autonomous research robots. So we seek partners in that if you are interested. With that, I'd like to briefly think about, I've talked a little bit about what our directions are, but these are in terms of nanotubes, but really just in terms of expanding research capabilities and helping others build their own research robots. And I'd like to acknowledge support from Air Force Office of Research, AFOSR, and also all of the audience for their attention. And again, thanking UIUC for inviting me to present. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the great presentation. So now let's turn to the audience.
I can start with a quick question until everyone gets ready. So Benji, this is an amazing talk. Every time I listen to parts of this talk. It's like so refreshing. Anyway, that our approach has been for graphene. Basically, we were inspired by your work, but we decided to go crowdsourcing because my idea is similar to what you mentioned earlier, is that if we're going to do tube furnace type synthesis, and this is what you want to, let's say experiment on, then it's very slow. So we cannot do what you did with the laser system that allows you to accelerate the experiments. But it also brings so many challenges because it's crowdsourcing is not a controlled system like you have. Do you have like any comments or thoughts on this in general? Have you thought about this? Because now that you're building this ARIS system, let's say, for additive, you can have like different network machines, right? And it's still sort of crowdsourcing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I think that as you say, that is a challenge, but we very much need to iron it out. And so I think that also goes towards Dr. Ferreira's comment about networking ARIS robots together. So how do you make those connections? And part of it is, as you were mentioning earlier, sort of a data standardization, right? How do you make an interface so that we can talk about the same things? But the other part is sort of in requesting. So if, for example, one group has say a tube furnace with different set of capabilities that you don't have, you would need to request that experiment be done. And so absolutely, I think that, trying to build a communication platform where you can request experiments be done and have them be executed and then reported in formats that are understandable, I think is very important. And so there's Professor Elsa Olivetti at MIT. She's doing a lot of interesting work on natural language processing, where there are algorithms that can read papers and extract recipes. But the corollary to that is actually writing things that are at the same time human understandable, human readable, but also that can be read by machines effectively. So I think having something that reports out so that you can do work that is easily transferable between groups, for example. And so I think that's what we're working towards with our 3D printers, so that the data are regularized sufficiently so that people can transfer data and experiments. I guess I'll answer Professor Wang's question. So the closed beta for ARIS OS, I would say just send me an email, please. And we'll get you on the list. And as I said, we expect if you wait a month or so, I think it should be open under AFRL license, which just means that we ask you to obviously adhere to normal open source license, and also let us know, who you are, what you're up to.
Okay, yes, very nice talk and quite exciting to see your thinking in terms of an OS. We also were working on something similar, and the OS that we work on is primarily a cloud-based OS, which allows you to network number of such platforms or number of such physical setups together. Right. And then maybe coordinate experiments across different bots. So we'd love to sort of talk about networking over your operating system so that your spare time on a particular reactor, or you can exchange capabilities and so forth, so that you can plan distributed experiments. Ultimately, the experiment involves physical motion, and we can save time on setups, we can save time on number of things, but finally it comes down to mechanical motions, and the only way to overcome the mechanical bottleneck, so to speak, is to parallelize so that you can do several experiments at the same time. So nice talk, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And if you have a slide on your OS, please, if you will, send it to me, because I'd like to try and keep up to date on the community. So, as I give these talks, I can tell people about what everybody's doing, not just what we're doing.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. So again, for Professor Wang, the hardware requirements. So the OS works with series of plugins, and so you would have to write a plugin that would be the interface between the Aries OS and your particular hardware. And of course, hopefully, as more and more people write those hardware plugins, so we already have one for microscopes and mass flow controllers and other kinds of hardware. We essentially build up libraries, sort of like a LabVIEW, where it becomes easier and easier to do. But as far as the software, the plugins, we have plugins in Python and in R, and so it's actually agnostic as far as the kind of language that you use. Essentially, what we do is we interface two G code, so we're not we're actually producing an interface that generates G code, but we're not generating G code ourselves. This is for Professor Karoi.